Hello, I'm Ari Berman, senior reporter from Mother Jones. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to all the readers who submitted great questions. We'll try to answer as many as possible in our discussion. I'm thrilled to be joined by Beto O'Rourke, former US Congressman from El Paso, Senate candidate in 2018 against Ted Cruz, candidate for president in 2020, and there's reports he may be running for another office soon. He's the founder of Powered by People, a grassroots group that works to register Texans to vote and mobilize volunteers. And he's been going around the state for the last year, organizing against attacks on voting rights. Beto can tell you all about the work he's been doing. This is a really timely conversation. The eyes of the nation watched as Texas Democrats fled the state over the summer to block the GOP from passing a sweeping voter suppression bill. Ultimately, it was signed by Governor Greg Abbott in early September. 21 states have passed 52 new voting restrictions this year, the largest rollback of voting rights since the Jim Crow era. Now states like Texas are back in session to begin the redistricting process, and through extreme gerrymandering, they could lock in anti-democratic power for the next decade at the state level and pick up enough seats to take back the US House. In Washington, Senate Democrats have introduced a new voting rights bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, that would outlaw many of these voter suppression tactics and ban partisan gerrymandering, but they still don't have a plan for reforming the filibuster to pass it. So we're at a make or break moment for democracy, and I'm thrilled to be joined by someone on the front lines of this fight. Hi, Beto, how are you doing?
Hey, Ari, I'm good, and it's good to be with you, and thanks for the invitation to join you today.
Thank you so much for joining us. So there was obviously a lot of attention over the voter suppression bill in Texas. There were numerous efforts to block the bill. Ultimately, it was signed by the governor. Now that it's in effect, what do you think the impact will be and what is being done to fight back against it?
Texas is already the toughest place in the country in which to cast a ballot and register to vote. And just some quick facts that support that assertion. In Texas, you cannot register to vote online, as you can do in almost every other state in the union. You got to walk down to the county courthouse, or if you still have a printer, print a form out and mail it in if you know what a stamp is. You've got to encounter a volunteer deputy registrar who's been certified and sworn in by the county registrar. They make it pretty hard on purpose, and it's had a devastating effect. And that was prior to what we're seeing today. When you add to that 750 polling place closures over the last 8 years, twice as many as any other state, and most of them concentrated in the fastest growing Black and brown neighborhoods and communities, one of the most onerous voter ID laws. And we were talking about gerrymandering, a gerrymandering that is not just partisan in its particulars, but is racial in its outcome. And in fact, a 3-judge federal panel, 2 of those Republican appointed judges, described Texas's political jurisdictions as a racial gerrymander. That's Texas prior to 2021. Now, with the passage and signing into law by Greg Abbott of SB 1, the elections bill, quote unquote, but the voter suppression and voter intimidation bill, it's going to be a lot harder for voters in urban counties to cast a ballot. It's targeting minority voters, young voters, and voters with a disability. So, for example, if you are not physically able to go to a polling place, you'll now have to prove your identity on your mail-in ballot, even though that identity was settled when you registered to vote in the first place. And it's going to be very hard for you if you want to do curbside voting, and impossible if you want to do drive-through voting, which was an option that was made available in 2020 to great advantage to the Republican and Democratic voters alike of Harris County and Houston, Texas. So it takes a rigged system and makes it even harder for the average Texan to participate. In 2020, get this one floors me no matter how many times I've repeated the statistic, 7 million eligible Texans did not cast a ballot in what was arguably the most important election since 1864. And that does not mean that we're lazy, that we have a lack of love for democracy. It means that these obstacles and impediments are really effective. And that's why we need something like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or the For the People Act, or the Right to Vote Act, or some major federal voting rights legislation that can unrig this system and just allow for free and fair elections in Texas and these other states that are under siege by these anti-small d democratic forces.
So Texas has 3 million unregistered voters, which is just an astounding number. It's larger than the total population of 20-something states. And the Texas Democratic Party did an analysis earlier this year. They estimate 2 million of those unregistered voters would vote Democratic if registered, which would be more than enough people to flip the state blue. So what is being done to register all of those unregistered voters?
Couple things. One is, we're able to track those who've changed addresses in Texas or moved into the state from other states. And especially in the latter case, we will know what someone's primary voting history is. So for example, if you move to Texas from New Jersey and you reliably voted in the Democratic primary, it's a good chance you're going to vote for Democrats going forward. We can run your change of address against your voter registration in Texas. If you have not registered yet, we can mail you a voter registration form, find your phone number, call up, encourage you to fill that form out, mail it in, and get you signed up, and then follow up with you before the next election. And there are hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than 1 million of those unregistered Texans who fall in that category of having moved and being registered in the National Change of Address Registry. Those are kind of the easy voters to get to. Much more difficult are those who have not changed addresses, haven't voted before, not because they just turned 18 or 19, but because they never saw a reason to participate in the political process. And really the only way to get to them is to go to them, and you got to show up. And as you know, Texas is a really big state that spans 2 time zones, 254 counties, 30 million people. And so we have asked our volunteers, a group that we started called Powered by People, to become volunteer deputy registrars, which empowers you to register someone to vote, which is a necessary precondition to going and knocking on someone's door. Do that first, then start knocking on the doors of your neighbors, finding those who are not registered and getting them on the rolls. It's a slow, laborious, work-intensive process, but it's the best way, short of this federal legislation we talked about, it's the best way to have a shot at winning elections in future years. In other words, just let the math do the work, get enough new voters on the rolls that even if there are impediments and obstacles that dissuade some, and unfortunately many, from voting, you'll have enough net new voters who actually do vote to make a difference. So far, our group, Powered by People, over the last year has registered well over 200,000 and counting. But as we spend more of our time going door to door, then you can imagine 2 hours of doing that, you might pick up 5 or 6 voters. So it's a numbers game in terms of the number of volunteers who you can get to sign up to do that work as well. It shouldn't be this hard. It is not this hard in most other states, but it is this hard today in Texas. And so we've got to play the hand we've been dealt. And that's some of what we're doing.
So Texas Republicans passed all of these unpopular policies recently. The 6-week abortion ban, allowing you to carry a gun without a permit, restricting how history can be taught. I mean, we could spend an hour just talking about these policies. And I think one of the reasons they passed all of these unpopular policies was they knew they were going to come back and gerrymander the state to protect their own power. And some of the new redistricting maps have already come out. One amazing stat is that under the state Senate map, 95% of demographic change in Texas came from communities of color. But 20 of 31 state Senate districts still have white majorities. So whites are a minority in the state, but they're a huge majority in the state Senate. And we expect the same kind of thing in the state House and the congressional map. So how are Texans supposed to hold the legislature accountable when the legislature is essentially choosing their own electorate?
I'm so glad that you drew the connection, because one could be forgiven for thinking these are just unrelated bad things that are happening in Texas. But the way that you get a 6-week abortion ban that places a $10,000 bounty literally on the heads of any woman who chooses to get health care, any Uber driver who takes her to the clinic, any doctor who performs a constitutionally legal procedure. The way you get that in permitless carry and anti-mask mandates and an electrical grid failure in the power center of North America, the way you get all of this is through the least small d democratic election system in the state of Texas that includes these heavily gerrymandered districts. And what you just described, the fact that 95% of the population growth that resulted in 2 new congressional districts being apportioned to the state of Texas, and all this wonderful opportunity in the state, that it has yet resulted in what could be a heavily white favored political map, is that racial gerrymander that those 3 federal judges talked about. And what is so pernicious about this is not only does it literally draw a Black Texan out of a district where they have true voting power into one where they likely do not, it furthermore diminishes the likelihood that they would vote. And I used to be one of those who rode the high horse and said, look, if you don't vote, you deserve what you get. And, you don't have a voice in the process, and, you're something wrong with you. I now realize it is not illogical to see yourself drawn out of your democracy almost literally. Realize that you have lower voting power than somebody else of a different race in that same district or the district you used to live in, and just say, fuck it. I guess I'm not supposed to participate. And I'm no longer going to lend this rigged system any credibility by participating in. I have a lot more respect and a lot less judgment for people who have made that decision in Texas. The way through that, of course, is to connect with those same disadvantaged voters whose voting power has been so weakened, and encourage them to believe that a vote this time will matter. And one of the things that really sticks with me from what Stacey Abrams has done in Georgia over the last 10 years is she has worked to persuade potential voters not so much to vote for the Democrat against the Republican, but to vote at all. In these heavily voter suppressed and voter intimidated states of the former Confederacy, it is a great leap of faith to participate in a process that has for a long time been corrupt and literally been drawn to disadvantage some to the advantage of others. That's the big challenge before us. The open question is, are there enough people willing to talk to those voters? Are there enough voters out there willing to listen? Can enough of us do this together to start winning elections and have pro-democracy people in positions of public trust who are there to listen and reflect the values of the people that they purportedly represent? When you have that, you don't get the abortion bills, the gun laws, all the other craziness that seems to define Texas politically today.
So Governor Greg Abbott has been a major advocate of voter suppression laws. Replacing him, Democrats say, would be a major step toward protecting voting rights. Is your work on voting rights part of your consideration as to whether you're going to run for governor?
It's interesting that you ask it that way, because when I thought about how I could be most effective for this state, and I hope this country, this year, it was on the issue of voting rights, because as you correctly pointed out, it is connected to any other right that matters to you. Any other issue that you could care about in a democracy is only going to be made better if everyone has a seat at the table. And understanding that, and also understanding that no matter who the candidate is, if you have a stacked deck or a tilted playing field, it may not matter who runs if you don't have free and fair elections. So everything that I had in my system was devoted to that, including supporting those courageous Democratic Texas legislators who left Texas to deny the Republican majority a quorum to steamroll voter suppression, and who took the fight to DC and our nation's capital, the one place where I think it can actually be won. But now that bill, SB 1, that they were fighting so hard against, has unfortunately passed and been signed into law. Now we have, thanks to Senator Klobuchar and Senator Manchin and many others, a compromise voting rights bill that I hope to and pray to dear God will pass. And if it means changing the rules of the filibuster to do so, so be it. I think I've done what I can do on this front. And I have turned my thoughts towards where we can be most helpful to the greatest number of people in this state. And no secret, I'm thinking about running for governor, and front and center in my consideration is just this, what it means for us to live in a democracy. And yes, it means registering to vote. And yes, it means getting out there and voting in important elections. But it also means this. You may or may not know, but despite the fact that Texas now leads the country in childhood mortality connected to COVID infections, our current governor, Greg Abbott, has issued an anti-mask mandate that seeks to prevent school districts from requiring masks in the classrooms. The result of this is the childhood deaths, the fact that there are no longer pediatric ICU beds available in many parts of the state. The Dallas County judge, for example, said, look, if your child needs one of these pediatric ICU beds, you pretty much have to wait for one of the kids in it to die for your child to get in. That is just how dire the conditions have become. What we did, empowered by people to meet this challenge in the most small d democratic way possible, was help to organize people in given communities around the state to petition and speak before their school boards and get them to do the right thing based on the public health imperative, not the polling necessity that Greg Abbott seems to be responding to. So whatever I do, and if that includes running for governor, I want to do it with the people of Texas. And I know that any chance that we might have will be predicated on those who are willing to take that kind of action together, collectively. And that, to me, Ari, is a big part of democracy. Apart from, or maybe, complementary to elections, is just the grind of civic work that you're willing to do in front of the school board, the zoning commission, your city council, that makes these communities better. And also the collective work that would allow a campaign to have a fighting chance to succeed. How many people can we put together to do the tough work of knocking on doors and registering voters and carrying a message to every eligible voter, not just current voters or consistent voters, but those eligible voters that no one's talked to because they've never voted in the past. I think that's the way forward. So that all of that is in the mix in my thinking.
Have you decided yet whether or not you're going to run for governor?
I have not made a final decision. I've given a lot of thought to it. I'm listening to a lot of people. The decision comes down to where and how can I do the most good for the greatest number of people here in Texas.
Regardless of your own eventual plans, do you see the governor as a major obstacle to protecting voting rights in Texas?
Absolutely. So you and I have talked a little bit about SB 1, that anti-voter elections bill that Governor Greg Abbott signed into law. The premise of that bill was that there was widespread voter fraud in the state of Texas. And lo and behold, the charge, if you listen to the governor, is that that's concentrated in Harris County, which is home to Houston, Texas. It's the most diverse city in the United States of America. It is part and parcel with the big lie trafficked by the former president that somehow he was denied his presidential victory because of voter fraud in Detroit, read Black voters, Philadelphia, Black voters, Atlanta, Black voters, Phoenix, brown voters. This very racist assault on our democracy that targets, as these assaults have for the duration of American democracy, Black and brown voters, is the central premise of the case that the governor is making here in Texas. And then Ari, I got to share this with you in case you didn't see it. His lieutenant governor, this guy named Dan Patrick, who is arguably just as, if not more powerful than the governor himself, in a peculiarity of the Texas Constitution, with this migration challenge and humanitarian crisis that we see in Del Rio right now, where there are upwards of 10,000 immigrants and asylum seekers from Haiti huddled under city bridges. The lieutenant governor's response to that was, first of all, calling it an invasion, which is the same language that President Trump used and that the El Paso shooter who slaughtered 23 Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals in my hometown 2 years ago because he feared a Hispanic political takeover of Texas. It's the same language these terrorists use. And the lieutenant governor went further and he said, if we let these Haitians in, they're going to have kids here, and their kids will be citizens, and those citizens will grow up to be voters, and those voters will politically take over this state. It's this level of racial resentment and this inducement to political terrorism that really concerns me right now. And that's got to be part of the conversation that we have about democracy, in addition to registration and voting rights and participating in elections. It's just the basic civic or even civilizational level of how this state is being run right now. So yes, what Abbott and Patrick and other Republicans who are in positions of power right now are doing, it is not only solidifying their purchase on power, it is literally destroying what Lincoln called the last best hope of earth, representative democracy. And so we've got to meet it on those terms and with the urgency that this crisis demands of us.
I want to ask you one more Texas question before we talk about some national issues relating to voting. So Texas obviously passed this 6-week abortion ban, which basically is a 2-week or less abortion ban. And one thing is interesting is that a lot of the states that have attacked reproductive rights have also attacked voting rights. So I'm wondering if you see a connection between those two issues. And also, what was your reaction when Governor Abbott said that he was going to eliminate rape in the state?
A lot of this, I mean, you tell me what you think. This is the best way I can draw the connection. When it comes to the attack on voting rights and democracy, it is in the short term about maintaining a purchase on power. You have a white Republican group of office holders who have held office in one form or another and held almost unitary control of Texas state government for more than 25 years, who understand that if there was a fair fight, if there were free and open elections of all eligible voters, they probably wouldn't win. And so in the most cynical way possible, they're holding on to power by depriving others of their power as voters. I think about the abortion issue in much the same way. It is not about life, and it's certainly not about children. I mean, if they cared about children, they would have fixed Child Protective Services. That's our agency that administers the foster children of this state, where it was so poorly run. Kids were sleeping on the desks, under the desks. Kids were dying in the custody of state care. You wouldn't have had 700 people die in the winter freeze because the power went out, including kids who literally froze to death in their beds in the state of Texas. This is not about life. This is about control, and this is about power. And this is about denying women the power to make their own decisions about their own bodies in their own lives. It is almost medieval in terms of scope and the ferocity of the attack on the women of this state. And what is so ironic to me, Ari, is that this past week, we learned that Mexico, our neighbor to whom we're joined at the hip to the south, has decriminalized abortion. So as Mexico moves in one direction, Texas is moving down in the other, passing Mexico on the way down. And it has profoundly deadly consequences for the women of the state. We lead much of the developed world in the rate of maternal mortality. It is 3 times as bad for Black women, in fact, in the state of Texas. And it has everything in the world to do with the denial of healthcare. We're the least insured state in the country, as over the last decade, we've closed so many of our abortion providing clinics and reproductive healthcare clinics. Women have gone not only without an abortion, they've gone without a cervical cancer screening or any healthcare at all. And so this kind of vigilante justice deal where you place that $10,000 bounty on the woman's head at the same time that you have allowed any Texan to carry just about any kind of gun without a background check in public, without a background check or a permit or any training whatsoever, it is going to be even deadlier going forward. And it is about power, and it is about control, and it is about taking more power and control at the expense of those who have historically been marginalized, whether those are minority voters or the women of the state of Texas. They're doing it full force right now. And again, this is why so many of us feel that Texas is in crisis at this moment, and we've got to meet it with the urgency that that crisis demands.
All right, let's talk national issues for a little bit. What were your thoughts on the Freedom to Vote Act, the new compromise voting rights bill introduced by Senate Democrats? And what would you say to senators like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who are reluctant to get rid of the filibuster to pass this?
I think this is a really positive development. And, you know, you're one of the few people who I feel like has kept the faith, not for a party and not for a given policy, but just that it is possible for us to move forward with voting rights when so many others saw the sky falling going back to the beginning of last year. You know, when we heard Senator Manchin say over and over again, I don't like the For the People Act, even though he was a co-sponsor of it in 2019, but whatever. When he kept saying, I won't vote for that thing, it's too expansive, it's too broad, there are too many problems with it. When we saw a lack of interest seemingly on the part of the president, though he described what is happening in America as the greatest attack on our democracy since the Civil War. Those were his words in Philadelphia at the beginning of the summer. We didn't see him holding, you know, the hundreds of meetings that he's held on infrastructure and other key priorities of his administration. When the pundits told us that with this incredibly slim functional majority that we have in the Senate, without Sinema and Manchin, there's no way forward. There was a very small minority of pro-democracy and voting rights advocates who said, you know what, there's still a way. And those who believed took action. And they marched. You know, I joined Bishop William Barber in the Poor People's Campaign, marching from Georgetown to Austin over 3 days and rallying on the steps of the Capitol. Black Voters Matter took their Freedom Riders bus through several key southern states that have tried to suppress voters by getting those same voters literally on the bus to the nation's capital. Those Democratic legislators from Texas, as we mentioned earlier, took the fight to the one place it could be won. And I think, look, I want to give credit to Senator Klobuchar and Senator Manchin, who's worked really hard on this compromise legislation. But I think the greater credit goes to the American people who kept faith and demonstrated that faith through the action that they were willing to take. I think that's the kind of pressure that produces the political will that we need in moments like these. And as you and I have talked about before, no way that LBJ uses all his political power in 65 to pass the Voting Rights Act, unless he's forced to do that by Andrew Young and Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others, including, importantly, those who marched with John Lewis across the Edmund Pettus Bridge 8 days before LBJ convened Congress and said, you have to pass this because this is the most important thing we can do as Americans and as members of Congress who have the power to do so. So all of that seems like it is coming together at this moment. And so, long way to tell you that I'm encouraged. And I'm not just encouraged that they've got yet another pro-democracy voting rights bill before them, but it's one, importantly, that Senator Manchin has had a hand in writing, and one that I think he will, in good faith, try to bring Republicans over to support. My hope, and I want to go beyond hope, my work will be to ensure that he is, for whatever reason, unsuccessful in bringing over 10 Republicans to support this legislation, which, as you know, in another generation would have been supported on a broad bipartisan basis. If he's unable to do that, that he and Senator Sinema, and frankly, the rest of the Democrats in the Senate will look at some alteration of the rules of the filibuster, not dispensing with it altogether, not getting rid of the filibuster, but as we've done for fast track trade deals, budget reconciliation deals, Supreme Court justices, federal judges, we can do for democracy what this country needs at this moment. So I'm actually hopeful, but I just want to reemphasize that hope will not carry the day. We've got to push and pressure these folks, or they won't act. And history has taught us that's the only way you move forward. They'll tell us, I know you're right, now make me do it. And so we've got to make them do it.
So Senator Manchin says that any voting rights legislation must be bipartisan. Senator Sinema says that if you get rid of the filibuster, when Republicans take over, they'll just pass a national voter ID law, national bans on vote by mail. So we should be careful what we wish for. What are your responses to those substantive claims in terms of keeping the filibuster?
Look, I don't think it's a slam dunk argument. And I think if those who are in favor of either getting rid of or altering the filibuster are being intellectually honest, we should understand the second and third order effects. And that's got to be part of any decision, any conversation. I think they're within rights to bring that up. The thing is, when you get to Senator Manchin's insistence that this be a bipartisan bill, he actually sought Republican ideas for the legislation and then included them in this. And as you probably know, there is a national voter ID requirement that Senator Manchin supports. It's actually one that I think many of us can support. It broadens the kinds of identification that would be admissible at a polling place, where in Texas, it's incredibly onerous. You can use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are, but you cannot use your student ID at the University of Texas to prove who you are. I think his proposal expands that to things like student IDs or utility bills or other common sense forms of identification that just about every single American has. So I think that meets, at least on its face, the concern from Senator Manchin. In terms of, what will happen to us as Democrats, or more importantly, as Americans, if the filibuster is changed and Republicans gain power in the Senate, I think we are right to assume that is going to happen regardless. I mean, if we had to predict, if we had to bet our own money on whether the filibuster will exist as it does today, 10 years from now, who would take that bet? It's going to change. And I can see Mitch McConnell, if he becomes Senate Majority Leader in 2024 and some future year, saying, look, and this is if Democrats don't amend the filibuster, look, Democrats blustered and they threatened to do this and they played a game of chicken with the American people. I want to make sure that we never have to face that possibility again. And knowing this is going to happen, the right thing to do for the American people is to change the filibuster or to get rid of it now that Republicans are in power. That is going to happen one way or another, under one party or another. Let it happen now at a time that we can come close to securing something like free and fair elections in America. And then one of the incidental benefits of that is Democrats will stand a much better chance of winning. And let me be clear, not because voting rights favor Democrats. I just think that competitive elections allow more voters, hence more likely Democratic voters, to participate in the decisions at the end of the day. And if we as Democrats or pro-democracy Americans are not willing to use every tool available to us, while Republicans are using every tool available to them to constrict and reduce and perhaps demolish the right to vote altogether, then we become complicit in the outcome. And I'm not in for that one.
What do you think the consequences will be if Democrats fail to pass voting rights legislation? Do you think they'll lose control of the House or Senate or both?
Yes. And I heard Amanda Littman, who runs this great organization called Run for Something, put it this way. Look, maybe not all of us know or track or understand the definition of filibuster or know exactly how many votes we have in the Senate or what Joe Manchin's political pressures are in West Virginia. But they will know that Democrats controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And if at the end of the first 2 years of the Biden administration, they were not able to produce significant victories, if they were not able to get legislation that matches their priorities and values, and in this case, namely the right to vote, especially, Ari, for those voters who propelled Democrats to historic victories in 2020. Joe Biden does not win without Black voters. Raphael Warnock, John Ossoff do not win those amazing upsets in Georgia without Black voters. Those same Black voters are the targets of voter suppression efforts in the state of Georgia. In fact, the very legislation signed into law by Governor Kemp under a painting of a plantation with a Black legislator dragged off in handcuffs, no less. That will not be lost on those same voters if, when the fight was engaged, Democrats walked off or stood on procedure instead of winning the damn thing at the end of the day when all the chips were on the line. So yes, we'll lose. And frankly, it'd be hard to argue that we wouldn't deserve to lose if we fail to fight now and fail to win this fight now.
If Republicans take back one or both houses of Congress, do you think they'll try to impeach Joe Biden? And also, do you think they'll try to contest the results of the 2024 election?
That great line, believe them when they tell you who they are or what they'll do, serves our purposes here. I don't know how many, I can't count the number of Republicans who have promised to begin impeachment proceedings on Joe Biden, the day that they're sworn in, if they're in the majority in 2023, after the elections of 2022. That is our future and our fortune and our fate in America, a hopelessly bogged down, divided, divisive government that is going to make it, frankly, Ari, even more appealing for the next fascist, authoritarian, Donald Trump-like figure, if it's not Donald Trump himself, who says, you know what, fuck this crazy, confusing, chaotic shit. I will make the trains run on time. Give me the power. Democracy clearly does not work. Look, it's just all a confusing mess. We thought we had an infrastructure deal. They promised you a higher minimum wage. They even said they were going to give you the right to vote or protect your right to vote. And they failed at all of that stuff. Give me the power. And I think we saw, again, a very clear preview of what the future is if we fail at this moment in the last 4 years or the 4 years of the Trump administration, ending in the most anti-democracy act I've witnessed in my life. And as Biden said, maybe that we've witnessed since the Civil War, which is the invasion by insurrectionists and coup plotters on the 6th of January, killing 5 people, including a Capitol police officer. They were literally going to hang the vice president of the United States in a public gallows constructed in front of the Capitol. They were going to murder members of Congress where they sat. That's our future. And we know that. And some like to satisfy themselves with this cold comfort that they didn't succeed on the 6th and that Joe Biden, in fact, was sworn in on the 20th. That's crazy if that's where you think the story ends. That's where the story begins. Hitler is a clown who fails in his coup in 1922 in the beer hall coup. In 10 years, he's chancellor of Germany. These guys are the Trump people, the Q people, the anti-democracy people are playing a very dangerous, violent game. And again, if we stand on the principle of a filibuster and deny ourselves the ability to effectively fight back and save this democracy, I really do fear, Ari, we lose it forever.
How concerned are you that Republicans are going to contest the results of the 2024 election? And I'm also wondering if you have reaction to the news that came out recently that conservative law professor John Eastman advised Mike Pence not to certify the election results for Joe Biden.
Yeah, this is some scary stuff, and it's not theoretical, right? And let's disabuse ourselves for those who still carry the notion that it's just rhetoric, and that we came through okay, more or less, in January of 2021 in the peaceful transfer of power, which so defines American democracy against the rest of the world, which has, for the most part, had a really hard time pulling that off. Texas, and I know you know this, Ari, but some of those who are watching and listening right now may not. The original version of SB 1, that quote unquote elections bill, contained a provision that would allow the state of Texas to overturn an election simply based on the allegation of fraud. There doesn't have to be real fraud or even proven fraud. An allegation of fraud is sufficient to begin the process of overturning an otherwise legitimate, lawful, democratically decided election. That's almost enshrined into law, exactly what Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and his other attorneys were arguing those various secretaries of state to do after the election results in 2020. As you know, in Georgia, those individual county level elections boards now are imbued with greater power through the legislature, which can wipe those boards out and replace them with their own people to overturn elections at the county level, which is just as devastatingly effective. So it's a real concern, and based not just on what Donald Trump might have done had he been successful in 2020, but what state legislatures are doing now in real time. All the more reason for the federal government to step in. Look, for those of you who are not from Texas and are understandably frustrated with our state, given what we are doing to American democracy right now, know this: the people of Texas are doing, and I would argue probably have done, all that we can do. We have fought the good fight as hard as we possibly could have. At this point, really the only salvation comes through federal action. Lincoln saw that at the end of the Civil War. LBJ saw that in 1965. We've got to see that right now in 2021, or we're really going to lose the thing. And we're going to lose it, Ari, along the procedural, technical, and now in some states, lawful terms of overturning these elections. And then you really just do not have democracy or anything resembling it anymore. What follows is bound to be something far more authoritarian, far more resembling fascism than American democracy, far scarier and deadlier for our fellow Americans. It is that existential, it is that fundamental, it is that important, it is that reason that I'm focused on this issue so squarely and with so many millions of our fellow Americans as well. So we really have to get after it. And this bill introduced by Senator Klobuchar, that's got to be the focus and priority of President Biden. Infrastructure is important, I get it. The spending budget reconciliation package, I understand why so much ink is spilled on that one. Immigration, there are no shortage of sensational, really important issues. None of them, however, come close to the impact that voting rights and democracy does, because it is literally who we are and why we exist and what we mean to ourselves and the rest of the world.
I'm going to go to reader questions now, and we got a bunch of good questions from our readers. Angela asks, and a lot of people ask this question: what steps can I take to protect voting rights in my state? And what can I do if I live particularly in a blue state?
Angela, I mentioned that one of the provisions of that Texas elections bill would have allowed our state to overturn elections based on the allegation of fraud. Here's an example of what you can do. So many people, and not just Democrats, were so pissed off about this once people like Ari and others reported on it and brought it to wider attention, because this thing was buried in the bill in the last 48 hours of its consideration. It wasn't in the initial draft. They wanted to sneak this sucker in. Well, with the disinfectant of the sunlight of accurate reporting on this, people took matters into their own hands, went to the town halls of these representatives, confronted them in their offices, and said, hey, what are you doing here? How in the world could you propose overturning elections? And that public pressure caused those Republican state legislators in Texas to start walking it back and even saying, look, I didn't know that was in the bill before I voted for it. That must be an error in terms of the composition. Let me take a look at this and get back to you. They were horrified that the truth had been discovered and that they were caught red-handed. And so in the next iteration of that bill, that provision was removed. So keep up the pressure locally, first and foremost, with your state legislators. And then secondly, and again, I think ultimately most importantly, President Biden, more like if you don't live in West Virginia, I would not bother calling Senator Manchin. If you don't live in Arizona, don't call Senator Sinema. If you live in those two states, then do those two things. But if you're in any other part of the country, call President Biden. This is in his hands. And let's remember, even LBJ said before passage of the Voting Rights Act, he told Dr. King, I don't have the power to do this. I'll never be able to overcome the, Senators Sinema and Manchin of his day. And what Dr. King and others did was they built the power for the president through those marches, through those, getting on the State House steps, lighting up the switchboard at the White House. They showed the president that the power was out there, and he then used it to get it passed. Let's remind President Biden now that he's got that power, and it's all of us and that we're with him on this, but he's got to use that power. and we're going to hold them accountable for using that power. So that's the way I'd meet that challenge on the state level and on the national level.
Another question coming from David in Coolidge, Arizona. How do you get information about these attacks on voting rights to people who listen to politics, who don't listen to politics, but vote every 4 years? And I'm curious, when you've knocked on a lot of doors in the last year and spoken to a lot of people, are people following these attacks on voting rights? Do they actually even know what's happening?
This is such a good question, and it's got such a, I don't know the answer all the way, but let me help further describe the challenge that we have here. So when reporters asked Governor Abbott or the chair of the elections committee in the state house, you keep saying there's a lot of voter fraud, and that's why you're introducing this, elections bill to try to stop fraud. Can you give us an example of voter fraud? And almost every case they never can, because you are more likely to be struck by lightning in the state of Texas than you are to encounter voter fraud. It is that statistically improbable. So what they do say is they say, I may not be able to point to a case of voter fraud, but what I'm hearing from my constituents is that they're concerned about voter fraud. And it's this crazy circular argument, because they, of course, the politicians, people like Greg Abbott and these state legislators, keep talking about voter fraud as though it exists, keep trafficking this lie, first introduced by Donald Trump and others, that there was widespread voter fraud. And I think people can be forgiven for believing their state rep, for believing the former president, for believing Fox News, for believing the channels from which they derive information about how the world works. So I don't judge them. Let's not talk down at them or at them, but let's listen to them and then engage in conversation with them and ask them to describe the voter fraud that they're so concerned about. And I think through that conversation, listen, I know that's not a quick fix, a silver bullet, a snap of your fingers. It requires a lot of work, and it requires a lot of us to do that work. But I don't know that us talking at each other is going to do it. And one idea might even be to change the rhetoric around this. I mean, if you hear me say voter suppression, you're like, all right, that guy's a Democrat and he's got, his point of view. If you hear somebody say voter fraud, that guy's a Republican, they've got their point of view. If we can, and I know I've used those terms a lot today in the conversation, but I think if we can talk about these issues in terms that people talk about in their everyday life, like, am I going to be able to vote, Beto? Are they going to try to stop me from voting? I knocked on someone's door, Ari, to your question. And I happen to be in Rains County in Emory, Texas, one of the smallest counties in the state of Texas, very rural, very Republican, very red. And I was knocking on a woman's door, and she said, well, I don't believe your bullshit about, voter suppression. And that's just a bunch of Democratic talking points and, blah, 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 blah. But we listened to each other. And I found out that she was I think a home healthcare attendant and works with a lot of people who have disabilities. And I said, hey, I hear you, ma'am, but I just want you to know that when you are trying to help one of your clients who has a disability to vote, it's going to be a lot harder in the following ways. And for your clients who can no longer sign their name, they're not going to be able to pass the voter identification test or the signature matching requirement that's in this. They're going to be disenfranchised. And listen, all of her clients are probably Republicans. And man, that registered with her. And she said, well, I didn't know that. Well, I'm gonna look this up. So how do I do that on a broader basis and reach more people? I doubt she's on right now listening to this Zoom, right? She may not be in this audience, but she's out there and she's a voter, and she's worth listening to and talking to. And only through that conversation where we're both sharing do we end up at something better than where we started. So it's an unsatisfying answer, but that's what I have found to be most effective. And thank God, with Powered by People, we've got a little over 20,000 volunteers doing that and holding those conversations across the state of Texas. I hope that makes some kind of meaningful difference.
Another question from Brett in Green Lane, Pennsylvania. He says, what is your opinion on ending the Electoral College? The GOP has only won one presidential popular vote since 1988, and that was a wartime vote in 2004.
Yeah, I mean, let's end it. And I won't, because you didn't ask, I won't get into the political practicalities of it or put on my pragmatic hat. It is an anti-democracy institution. And, I've got a 14-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And it's so hard to explain to them, like after the 2016 race, how did the person who got less votes end up winning the election? Well, let me explain, the compromises that were at play in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Like, it just, you can't explain it in a way that someone says, okay, this makes sense and this is fair and this is just. It's none of those things. And we would be a much better country for not having anti-democratic institutions like the filibuster or like the Electoral College. So that's my view on it. I'm very open to any path that gets us there.
How concerned are you about the laws? And this was a question from Mark in Menlo Park, California. How concerned are you about the laws that give partisan actors more control over the counting of votes and also criminalize routine election administration? I know in Texas, for example, there's a bunch of different provisions that could criminalize election officials if they send out vote by mail applications or they try to eject unruly partisan poll workers. How worried are you about the corruption of election administration and this threat of election subversion?
Yeah, this is part of what makes this stuff so evil. And for those of you who haven't listened to Ari's interview with Ezra Klein, or Ezra interviewing Ari, I loved it. And in part, it's because, you don't have what Texas had in 1923. 1923, the Texas legislature said literally, if you're Black, you can't vote in this state, right? They said the quiet part out loud. We knew what we were up against. Now they couch it in terms of, well, this is about voter fraud or standardizing elections, and who could be against that? And the devil is literally in the details. When you see in Texas that there are 15 new or enhanced criminal penalties, many of them targeting elections administrators, so that they will now, the desire, I think, on the part of Republicans is they'll be afraid to intervene when a partisan poll watcher comes in and intimidates a voter and causes a ruckus or tries to dissuade somebody from voting altogether. That elections administrator or poll worker doesn't want to go to jail, doesn't want to be sued by Ken Paxton, our twice indicted attorney general. And they may just beg off and just say, you know what, I got to let this thing slide. The criminalization of our elections and of administrators, in addition to voters, and primarily voters of color, like Crystal Mason, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for erroneously voting a provisional ballot when she was on probation. Nobody risks going to jail or prison for 5 years to doing that. It was an honest mistake, and it's why we have provisional ballots in the first place. Let's be clear, it's not just to lock people up, and it's certainly not about securing our elections. It's about scaring people into not voting at all or not doing their jobs as the administrators of those elections. And then to your question, when we actually invite partisan actors into the counting process, or in Texas into the so-called poll watching process, which has a long sordid history stretching all the way back to the poll watchers of the Ku Klux Klan who stood guard outside of polling stations in Texas to stop Black Texans from voting, then I think you understand what we were up against. And the tough thing is, it really does rely on the great reporting that you see from Ari and others. It really relies on those who are willing to do and have the diligence to do the hard work of reading through this code and counting up the 15 new or enhanced criminal penalties and understanding who that's going to impact. And look, by the time you said all that, you might have bored somebody to tears. It's not the slam dunk, Black people can't vote, or we're going to stop disabled people from casting a ballot. It is far more sophisticated and therefore I think far more dangerous. And I think ultimately, I think there's some of this that will be decided in the courts. A lot of this that could be stopped through federal legislation. And then ultimately, you're going to have to elect people who believe in democracy into positions of public trust to write this course. But as Ari mentioned at the outset, we haven't seen anything like this since pre-1965 Jim Crow in America. That is where we are today.
Beto, we have to wrap in a second, but I got to ask you, what is that sign behind you? And were you drinking from a Whataburger cup?
Yeah, this is a recycled, not a styrofoam Whataburger cup, just to be clear. Yeah, I think I may very well hold the record of eating more Whataburger than anyone else. We lived on that in the Senate campaign for 2 years. So I've got this commemorative Whataburger cup. That's what I got out of one of the things I got out of the 2018 race. My grandmother, Charlotte Williams, in 1951 started a furniture store here in El Paso, Texas. And it was kind of unusual at the time for a woman to start and run and grow a very successful business. And she passed away, almost 20 years ago. My mom ran the business up until about 2 or 3 years ago. And so we no longer have Charlotte's furniture, but I've got this sign behind me, and I just keep it as a memento of her and what she was able to accomplish in her life. So that's why it says Charlotte's behind me.
Well, Beto, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your time, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Ari.
Really appreciate it. And to everyone watching, thank you. We'll be posting a version of this conversation online, and you can follow all of our voting rights coverage at motherjones.com. Thank you so much for joining us.